Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all. This is another edition of Canada's most irreverent talk show, The Andrew Lawton Show, here on True North on this Tuesday, June 21st. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Is it the first day of summer today? I always forget. It's in and around now. The 20th or the... No, it's the 20th. What am I... I've got the day wrong, so just don't even listen to me at all. It's June 20th. It still could be the start of summer. I don't know. The weather is nice where I am, but I just saw that Jasper had like a dumping of snow the other day, which I guess is par for the course if you live in that part of Alberta. But that is the one thing. I love everything about Alberta. I would live in Alberta in a heartbeat. I used to work in Alberta. That's the one thing that I don't necessarily get on board with. It's the whole snow in June. So if we could like global warming ourselves out of that problem, it would be the absolutely perfect province. But nevertheless, we're not here to talk about the weather, at least not always. I do want to talk in a little bit with former Finance Minister Joe Oliver about this kerfuffle. It's a little bit more than a kerfuffle, perhaps a din and a do, I don't know. This controversy involving the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. A Canadian comms guy on that bank resigned last week, triggering a whole withdrawal of Canada, or at least a temporary freezing of Canada and its involvement in this Beijing-headquartered bank, which has long been criticized as being a financial tool of the Chinese Politburo. And now, finally, it seems Canada has decided to recognize this. So we'll talk to Joe Oliver about that very shortly in the program. I want to begin by doing something which is in some ways against my better judgment, but I still feel is important here. I don't like the ins and outs. I never cover polls on this show because I find polls to be just the utterly uninteresting thing that you can talk about in politics that are also pretty inconsequential. I mean, sometimes you may get a peripheral insight about politics from a poll, but they tell you nothing. And even though it's an overused slogan, the only poll that matters is the one on election day, is kind of true. So yesterday, we did have an election day poll. 4 to be specific, in 4 ridings across the country. One of them in Ontario, not far from me, Oxford. One of them, well, 2 of them actually in Manitoba. One is Portage, Lisgar, the other Winnipeg South Centre, and then another in Montreal. Now, the top line news of this is that there is zero change whatsoever. Any party who held the seat going into the by-election holds the seat now. But that doesn't mean there isn't a little bit that maybe you should take away from a couple of the ridings. In particular, the 2 that the Conservatives won, Portage, Lisgar, and Oxford. Now, Oxford is both of these ridings have been on my radar because I've covered them and some of the fights within them on this show. Oxford, just by way of catching you up, was the riding in which the Conservatives did not allow Garrett Van Dorland, a prominent social conservative activist and organizer, to run. Instead, they seemed to prefer Arpan Kana, and while they didn't appoint him, he was the winner of the nomination once Van Dorland was out of the way. But this raised the ire of Dave McKenzie, who had this riding for, I think, 17, 18 years. He had the riding for quite a while. And Dave McKenzie wanted his daughter to be the MP. He wanted his daughter, Deb Tate, to be his successor. She was running for the nomination. And he was just all pissy and ended up endorsing the Liberals. So you had the former Conservative MP knocking on doors with the Liberals, knocking on doors, talking to Chrystia Freeland at the door. You had Dave McKenzie running radio ads when I was driving around. I live in London, which is not Woodstock or Oxford County, and they were just blasting these ads into London as well. And I was hearing, oh, I'm the former Conservative MP, but I'm standing up for the Liberals, yada, yada, yada. So it was a riding, and there was one poll that came out last week or earlier this week, whatever it was, and that poll had a dead tie between the Conservatives and the Liberals. And I didn't believe it, but it was one to watch. Anyway, the Conservatives still won the riding. Arpan Kana, who I actually worked with in Ottawa many years ago, ended up winning the riding with 43%. He had about, 2,700 vote lead over the Liberals, which is, again, a win is a win. And I don't want to start getting into this whole, like, well, maybe a win is a loss, and maybe a loss is a win, and maybe a win is a win, but it's kind of a loss, like all that sort of stuff. Because, yeah, all you need to win is one more vote than the other guy in elections, or the other gal, so to speak. But the one thing I will say is worth noting here is that this is not the best showing for the Conservatives. And the 2021 election, Dave McKenzie had 47%, the Liberals had 20%. The 2019 election, Dave McKenzie had 48%. The NDP actually came second with 20%, 48 to 20. And in 2015, again, Dave McKenzie, 45, and the Liberals in second place at 32%. So this is a commanding result for the Liberals, even if it is still a loss. And do we take from that Dave McKenzie was just so eager to support the Liberals that a bunch of Conservatives voted Liberal? Maybe, maybe not. You never know. But I do think that there might be a bit of a caution in this to the Conservative Party, which is that when you attract the wrong kind of attention to a riding, sometimes these results are going to happen. And I thought Garrett Van Dorland would have made a good candidate. I have nothing against Arpan Canna. I think he was a fine candidate. And I know from having been a candidate who was appointed in the past, I've talked about this, my own experience in 2018, it is tremendously unfair to everyone, including the person who is the appointed candidate. Now, again, Arpan was not appointed, so that's not the issue. But I'm saying that when the party starts mucking around in nominations and deciding who's running and who's not, beyond really brazen disqualifying things, the person who's the beneficiary of this, either directly or indirectly, all of a sudden has an albatross that they have to carry. And so this is, again, a caution for the Conservative Party of Canada in that. But Portage Lisgar, let's talk about that, because this was the one that I ended up having to wade into last week when Maxime Bernier decided that Andrew Lawton and True North were big old sellouts and all that. And I don't want to rehash the whole WEF Portage Lisgar controversy. You can listen to last week's shows if you want to get caught up on that. But the big question here was, is the PPC alive or is the PPC dead? That was the question heading into this, because in the 2021 election, the People's Party of Canada had its strongest showing nationally in this riding. And in 2021, Maxime Bernier wasn't the candidate, but the PPC got 21.58%, which was a significant dent to Candice Bergen, the Conservative candidate, who is used to like pulling in 70% like she did in 2019, but in 2021 got 52%. Now, again, you're still winning with more than half of the voters, but this signaled a pretty big issue for the Conservatives if the PPC numbers kept up. So if you do the big drum roll here, the PPC ended up pulling in 17.2% yesterday. Now, that is with Maxime Bernier, the leader of the party, standing as the candidate. That is with an aggressive campaign, a well-known guy. And it is, again, I think a bit of a caution. Now, look, if the PPC were to pull in 17.2% nationally, it would be a tremendous achievement. But in the riding that they were trumpeting as their strongest, it is not exactly great. And by the way, I talked to Maxime Bernier about this in my first interview with him about this race, and I gave him a bit of an out. I said, what to you is a win? This was that clip. So we were discussing earlier, Maxime, the PPC did very well in Portage Lisgar relative to everywhere else in the country. It was the strongest riding, and I know you obviously want to win, but as far as the bigger picture here, what do you consider a win short of a victory on the ballot? I mean, do you feel that you need to get that 20% of the vote to prove that the PPC is still the force it was in 2021?
I like your question, Andrew. A win is a win. So a win for me will be to be the MP for people in Portage Lisgar. And I'm here campaigning full time for them. My schedule is full and I'm very pleased with that. So for me, a win is to be their MP the night of the election. And I believe that it's doable. We have a strong team, and people understand they have the opportunity to send a message to Ottawa right now. And, it's not about splitting the vote. That ridiculous argument is not valid. We won't change the government. The Trudeau government will be there after the election. So it's safe for them to vote for the PPC, to vote for me. And actually, I will be their insurance policy that Poilievre, if he has the courage to be a conservative, I will support him. But I will bring that debate in Ottawa, and I will support Poilievre when or if he is a real conservative with real conservative family values. So it's a win-win for people in this riding, and they understand that. That's why my answer to your question is a win is a win.
Well, as you heard there, his answer was pretty clear. A win is a win. So in contrast, this is a loss. Now, how the party is going to spin this in the days and weeks to come, I don't know. But the big question was, does Pierre Poilievre have a PPC problem on his hands? I don't think he does based on these results. Now, obviously, the PPC could rebuild and they could have a great showing, and maybe next election they'll find some other riding like Portage Lisgar where they have some strangely uncharacteristic and positive response. And I know that because of this fight that ended up emerging last week, people think that I have it out for the PPC, and that's actually in no way true. And there have been many cases where I've said, if the PPC were to be elected to something, it would be a pretty significant accountability measure for the Conservatives. Because remember, the PPC only exists as a protest party. It is a party that was created because, in Bernier's eyes, the Conservatives were morally and intellectually corrupt. Which means that under ideal circumstances, the moral and intellectual corruption that is purported to be in the Conservative Party of Canada would be fixed and everyone could be united again. It was the Reform Party that fixed the Progressive Conservative Party. It was the Wild Rose Alliance that fixed the Alberta PCs. These fractures and reunitings, if I can use that word, can be tremendously powerful if a party has lost its way. And the problem, though, is that the PPC right now, to a lot of its supporters, by no means all, but to a lot of its supporters, is perpetually and indefinitely positioned on the outside of the mainstream, whatever the mainstream is. And trust me, I understand why you might want nothing to do with the mainstream of what passes for a mainstream today. That is not a judgment on my part. I'm saying that there seem to be a lot of PPC folks I talk to that relish being on the outside and never quite want to be on the inside. And that's going to be, I think, the big challenge. I know for a fact that there are a lot of people that are really diehard PPC supporters that are Maxime Bernier bust, and that's fine. That's your prerogative. But I know there were, in 2021, a lot of soft PPC supporters that said, well, I would vote Conservative if Leslyn Lewis were the leader. Or I would vote Conservative if Pierre Poilievre were the leader. Well, you fast forward, and Pierre Poilievre is the leader. And a lot of those people, the PPC, I think, is having trouble keeping on to as voters. And again, by-elections can be weird and they can be anomalous, and you never want to extrapolate too much from these things, but it is a cautionary tale on all fronts. I think there's a caution against the Conservatives in Oxford County of what happens when nominations attract the wrong type of attention, and I think in Portage Lisgar there is a caution against the PPC that maybe they are not going to coast in as strongly as they did last time and have the upward trajectory that they did last time, which was inconsequential and undeniable in the 2021 election. But a little backward looking into 2021 is, I think, important here because Aaron O'Toole has finally surrendered his seat in Parliament. I say finally, not like I'm glad to see him go, but just because he announced it a little while ago and now he's formally ended this, and he has given his farewell speech in the House of Commons and had some parting words about conservatism that he shared on CTV.
You know, the Conservatives won the popular vote in the last two elections. It just wasn't efficient enough. And Mr. Trudeau, some of the polarization is actually focusing and over-delivering your small cohort. So he's now won 2 minority governments with a smaller popular vote, and in some elections being virtually shut out in certain provinces of the country. So I think had the pandemic not been a part of the discussion, I had a lot of fiscal Conservatives that wanted to see the Conservatives with a smart plan on the environment. a lot of business leaders, for example, or small business owners that wanted to make sure they lowered emissions for their kids, but were worried about our competitiveness, worried about trade relations, thought Mr. Trudeau's ethics were questionable. So there's a bunch of voters that want to see the Conservatives address all issues. I think Pierre will do that.
So Aaron O'Toole there, I believe, was characterized uncharitably in this CTV tweet that went around, and I shared it myself, in which it says, Aaron O'Toole tells Vashi Capellos he still believes the Conservative Party needs to moderate if it's going to win the next election. He didn't use those words, but he did make that implication when he talked about, believing that they needed a smart plan on the environment. So he is still actually standing by his decision to introduce a carbon tax, despite it being probably the most singularly unpopular issue within the Conservative base, because it angers the red Tories even, who, like, the only thing you can kind of get them on is fiscal conservatism. It angers the blue Tories. It angers the social conservatives because, who likes a carbon tax regardless of anything else. So Aaron O'Toole is still standing by that and still kind of claiming that, the Conservatives would win the election if they had a plan on the environment. Well, you did that. You did that. We listened. And I sort of cheekily said in response to the tweet here that, if only we had some way of knowing what would happen if Aaron O'Toole's vision of the Conservative Party were to stand in an election. Hint, hint, we do. It was that vision that tried to give everything to win Quebec and failed to do so, that tried to give everything to win the GTA and failed to do so, that tried to expand the base by moving ever closer to the center and even the left, and it did not work. And I said in an interview recently, I can't even remember who I was talking to, that while I didn't love how the Conservative Party went in that last election, I thought it was tremendously important that they did, because now we have the test case. Now we have the definitive proof of what happens if the red Tory fantasy and the red Tory delusion is put in motion. You get a campaign that looks exactly like the one the Conservatives ran in 2021, and you get a loss that looks exactly like the Conservative loss in 2021. And don't give me the, but they won the popular vote, because that and $5 doesn't even get you a latte at Starbucks. I had to correct the metaphor midway through, because I don't actually know what a latte costs at Starbucks now, but I'm assuming it's more than $5 because, inflation kills anything and everything. That does it for us for now. I want to take a quick break. We'll be back talking about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with the great Joe Oliver. Stay with me.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. Last week, there was a bit of a geopolitical firestorm of sorts that started with the resignation of a Canadian gentleman by the name of Bob Picard from the AIIB. Now, this is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, a Beijing-based bank that's been around for 7 years or so. And it might not surprise you, if you followed anything to do with this institution in the past, to hear what Bob said in his parting words after resigning. He tweeted that he has tendered his resignation as a patriotic Canadian. This was my only course. The bank is dominated by Communist Party members and also has one of the most toxic cultures imaginable. I don't believe that my country's interests are served by its AIIB membership. He later added to that by saying that the Communist Party hacks hold the cards at the bank. They deal with some board members as useful idiots. He believes that Canada should not be a member of this PRC, that's the People's Republic of China instrument. The reality of power in the bank is that it's CCP from start to finish. Now, he's been there for about a year. There are other supposedly esteemed individuals, former Treasury secretaries, that sit in this organization. But now Canada has, in light of this, decided to put a freeze on its contributions to the AIIB and have a review, which the bank, of course, says it has nothing to hide. There's nothing to see here. We'll totally cooperate. You won't find any Chinese communist institutional officials in this. I'm less convinced. I want to talk to former Finance Minister Joe Oliver about this. Now, obviously, this was not an institution that existed in the time that you were in government and that Stephen Harper was there. It came in 2016. But I'm guessing for you, this is not something that is all that surprising to see these allegations.
Well, no, not really, because we knew, of course, the Asian infrastructure investment bank would be dominated by the Chinese. We had an opportunity to join in 2015 when I was a Minister of Finance, and we declined. And I looked at the opportunity, let's call it that, and concluded that really there was no interest in Canada joining. There was quite a significant cost. It wasn't precisely defined, but it looked like it was going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I didn't really see an upside. I mean, for one thing, our big pension funds would, of course, be welcome to participate in an infrastructure project if they wanted to, because they had billions of dollars to invest. And as far as Canadian construction companies and others who might be involved on a sort of a pay-to-play kind of a basis, the history was not very good in terms of Canada's ability to participate. We in fact participated in the previous 10 years about 1% of total projects. So I really didn't see the upside other than a real kind of a feel-good photo op, which in fact happened 3 years later when then Finance Minister Bill Morneau announced to the public that Canada, amongst great fanfare, and the Prime Minister was involved in the Photoshop as well, obviously, because they had a very friendly attitude to China, that they were going to join, and they never really discussed what the cost would be. If you look at the annual report of the AIIB, you see that Canada has a subscription of close to $1 billion. But that doesn't mean we paid that full amount in, but we've been paying, I gather, about $40 million a year. We're moving towards $200 million, which isn't pocket change, in my opinion. And as far as I can determine, we've got precisely nothing out of it. In the meantime, of course, our relationship with China has deteriorated for a variety of reasons that Canadians are well aware of.
Just going back to 2015 there, when you and the Canadian government decided not to get involved in this, was that purely a financial decision, or was there a concern that this would become an instrument of the Chinese Politburo?
Well, we assumed that, of course, it would be, because everything major that China is involved in commercially has control by the party, and we knew that at the time. Perhaps that wasn't widely understood, but it was pretty obvious. And as I recall, the Chinese didn't put pressure on us to join. They encouraged us to, but I didn't feel any muscle in that regard. And on the other side of it, the Americans, who were quite critical of the British joining the AIIB, explicitly told us, Jack Lew, who was the Secretary of Treasury at the time, told me that he wasn't really asking us not to join, but he just wanted us to be aware that there were concerns on their part in terms of governance, procurement, corruption, even environmental issues about the types of projects they were involved in. Now, they, of course, the Americans, viewed the AIIB as a competitive institution to the World Bank and other institutions that they were supportive of. So they were clearly unhappy with that development. But as it turned out, Japan was the only other G7 country, aside from Canada, that didn't join.
Now, the one thing that I should say, just for those who don't follow this, China is launching, and has been for several years, this incredibly costly Belt and Road Initiative, where they're basically, I think, entrapping a lot of developing countries. They're building, these brand new ship ports and airports in countries that never could have afforded these things on their own without a lot of help. And a lot of that is being funneled directly through the AIIB. So, I mean, this is really a part of this, great Chinese economic conquest, this institution.
Yeah, well, there's no question. It's all coordinated with a view to extending China's reach internationally, and have first have countries and institutions recognize that China has the second largest GDP, and that it's very assertive, and it's demanding respect, and more than that, dominance in the South China Sea and elsewhere. And they're using their financial muscle to increase their influence around the world, in particular with less developed countries, where, as you implied, they're using their financial instruments to get into projects that they wouldn't necessarily be welcome in. But if these projects aren't able to return the interest rate that they're owed to the Chinese government, then of course China can seize the assets and get control of ports and airports and other major infrastructure projects that the country or the borrower wouldn't otherwise sell to them.
You looked at the dollars and cents in 2015, as we were talking about a moment ago, and you said you just don't see the economic benefit here, among other issues. How did that change? I mean, obviously with the new government comes new priorities, but when the Liberals came in and joined this, how did they make that value proposition? Because the numbers probably hadn't changed all that much between when Canada decided not to join and when Canada decided eventually to join.
No, I don't think the numbers changed at all. And in fact, the subsequent history proves definitively that we were right, that there was nothing in it for us. But if I may be permitted a partisan comment, the Liberals don't seem to put high priority on fiscal prudence, and they weren't particularly worried about the cost. Maybe they viewed it as a development exercise. I think it was more, wanting to be in the room with the big boys and cozying up to China, which they're trying to do. And of course, we know the Prime Minister's personal history and his father's history in this regard. So I don't think they ever attempted to justify it on a cost-benefit perspective, for they were looking at the so-called bigger picture of participating in another multilateral organization and being a big boy in international infrastructure development. But let me just, in that regard, I think there's another important point to make, and that is that our willingness to put hundreds of millions into the AIIB could have been better spent if, in fact, we felt compelled to spend money in respect to domestic infrastructure in our own country, which is sorely needed and would help with improving our productivity, which is at a very poor level. In fact, the OECD said that Canada is going to have a poor record of GDP to per capita growth of any other wealthy country in the entire world. Well, infrastructure is part of that problem. So, that money could better be spent in Canada. Now, the money is not available. Of course, it wasn't available. So it represents additional borrowing by the government of Canada. And needless to say, we borrowed a lot. Our debt is approaching 1.2 trillion, and the interest on the debt will be, I think it's going to be up to $50 billion a year by 2027. And I think it's approximately 45 billion. It's over $4,000 a year for a family of four. So adding more debt is not an attractive proposition, and it wasn't for us then.
Yeah, and you're right that there are times when maybe you can justify the elective spending, and we have not been in one of those periods for the last few years, certainly. And I guess I'll ask about this in the broader context of Canada's relations with China, because I know that the Conservative government has been criticized for the free trade agreement with China that Stephen Harper promoted. I think that was 2014.
No, there was no free trade.
Well, that's how it's been criticized. But the FIPA is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, but no, this is an important point. There's trade.
Okay, no, and that's fair. And I was being imprecise as I set up the premise. So I'll let you characterize it, but I'll just ask, as you characterize that, do you have any regrets about that effort that the Conservatives made to really try to cement these ties with China?
No, we've got to set the record straight there. We were in favor of trade with China if it advanced our economic interests. I mean, after all, given its size, and everybody's talking about kind of reducing our dependency on trade with the United States, which represents 75% of our trade. You don't turn your back on a huge market, but I certainly wasn't in favor, and neither was the Prime Minister, which is more important, in favor of a free trade agreement with China at that time or at any time since. It just didn't make sense. Now, I personally,
but it was liberalizing trade with China.
Yeah, but look, I went to China many times, and I saw a strategic complementarity between Canada and China in this respect. We needed to diversify the markets for our oil and gas, and they needed to diversify their sources of supply. Being able to sell more oil and gas, or any oil and gas, to China would have had enormous beneficial impact on Canada because of the hundreds of billions of dollars we could have earned. Also, if we sold gas, we would have been able to reduce net global emissions because that gas would be substituting for much higher emitting coal. So there was an environmental advantage to that as well. And I had an opportunity once to actually discuss that issue with President Xi Jinping. Interestingly, when the former Governor General David Johnson was in Beijing, and he had arranged a meeting with the president, and Xi Jinping agreed. Now, that wasn't going to change the world, but if anything, it might have somewhat reduced the asymmetry between our two countries, but it never would have reduced or increased our dependency on them because. If you could, the tragedy was, of course, we couldn't deliver. But if we could have delivered, we could have delivered to anyone in the world. And it's a terrible economic cost that hasn't happened, and I think we all know why. But it would have been, that particular trade would have been advantageous to Canada and in Canada's national interest.
And that last part is key when we're talking about that, and certainly the AIIB. Former Finance Minister Joe Oliver, always a pleasure, Joe. Thanks for coming on.
Great to have me.
That was Joe Oliver, former Minister of Finance in Canada. As soon as the word left my mouth, I knew that I had stepped in it because it wasn't a free trade deal. I meant to say, freeing the trade, liberalizing, making it a bit easier, but I went for the shorthand, and Joe Oliver rightly called me on it. But nevertheless, very insightful guy. We'll have to have him back on more often. That does it for us for today. Remember, special edition of the Andrew Lawton Show tomorrow, a full-length sit-down with Tamara Leach. That's all coming up in just 23 hours here on The Andrew Lawton Show. Thank you, God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.